So the way I've been thinking a bit about this recently, and something I wanted to talk about, is like at every stage of this pipeline, Schlumberger are involved, and at every stage of the pipeline, harm is taking place. But where you've got your oil rig, you've got a compound, and there'll be like the oil company is there in their little shed trailer thing, and then you've got Schlumberger who are doing the drilling, and like subsidiaries of those things who are doing all their little bits. And Schlumberger provide a lot of that infrastructure. So both the actual physical drills and things like that, all the little bits that go into it, the lifts, they research all of these things, but they provide the workers as well, which means that they're doing a lot of the worker exploitation. One of the things they're branching out now into, which is part of their greenwashing thing, is like AI and digital twinning. So they're looking at making this all like slicker and speedier and blah blah blah, but it's still just maximizing profits from oil and gas. So digital twinning is where they create like a digital version of an oil rig or a wind turbine, it can be apparently, which they can then measure how it's doing by replicating it through AI. And that's one of the things they're doing, and they're saying is so great, but it's still just oil and gas extraction now. Does anyone want to suggest some of the things that kind of the harm at the early end, when it's in the ground, maybe even before, when the idea of exploration happens, what kind of harms are taking place there?
Land's been taken away from indigenous people without them agreeing or wanting.
Absolutely, like it transforms the land from like a place of like home and harvest to a product, and that's often done in really, really corrupt ways. Like if you're lucky, you might be compensated for the land that's stolen from you. The Nigerian government, when it realised how much oil there was in the Niger Delta, it did compensate people, but only for the value of the crops that were currently on the land, and not for the value of the land that they were going to extract from people. If you're unlucky, it's taken from you with just brute force. So what happens next? What kind of harms happen once you found there's oil there, you've stolen the land? What happens?
I think the whole process is a lot of harm done to the animal kingdom as well.
Yeah,
to
exactly.
nature,
yeah.
trees, plants, animals.
Biodiversity.
All suffer from this kind of thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. So just in terms of like it being transformed into this industrial area, it's like complete biodiversity change and mostly loss.
Whole chain of things affected.
What else?
Well, so as oil or gas is oil in particular, as it's extracted, it will leach into the surrounding land, causing, well, I was going to say, devastating pollution, which is also going to have human health impacts on people living there. So it seems to be like a major cause of cancer. It seems to affect people's vision. There's also respiratory illness, this sort of thing, which can last for generations.
So the guy who I know who used to work for Schlumberger in drilling, his job was to monitor the drilling fluid. So this fluid is usually like terrible chemicals. They can use slightly less terrible chemicals, and they only do that in countries with more regulations. So in Ecuador, they're not subject to many regulations. He noticed that the drilling fluid wasn't coming up as much as it went down, which means that it was escaping through cracks in the well into the groundwater. And as you say, that is like causing harm, and that is one of the things that we know for certain is happening on Schlumberger drilling sites, because we've had like a Schlumberger worker tell us that. So that actual process of just drilling is harmful. Like land, when it's being stolen from people, when they find oil, when they start exploring. We've talked a bit about drilling and how drilling pollutes the groundwater. What about at that stage of kind of like extraction and refining? Can anyone think of anything else that's happening there in terms of harm, maybe like human harm that's happening? We also mentioned like biodiversity loss.
Effective corruption of local politics.
Complete corruption of local politics. This is one of the things, a lot of the examples I'm going to give today are about the Niger Delta, just because I was reading about it yesterday. But the incursion of Shell and Chevron that was facilitated partially by Schlumberger completely transformed Nigeria into a petro state. It was already kind of fucked, to be honest, by the British government pushing together all of these different groups to form a country, but so much of the conflict between those groups has taken place as like oil wars essentially. And there's so much money and so much power and corruption that is tied up. We're seeing this really in Ghana as well. So there wasn't a huge oil industry in Ghana until Schlumberger found a huge amount of offshore oil, and it has transformed Ghana. Essentially, it's in the process of becoming a petro-state because of SLB, because of Schlumberger's exploration and just taking over. I think it was in 2007 that this huge offshore field was found, and it's just like transformed the local political system. They're in education, they're everywhere in Ghana. Exactly what you're saying. The women who work in Schlumberger have like repeatedly raised the fact that they are subjected to quite extreme sexual violence, while they're often working in remote places with a lot of men. Schlumberger's response to this is largely to be creating like a girl boss Instagram where they're like women of Schlumberger, rather than actually responding to the legal cases against them for sexual harassment in the workplace. Like serious, like harassment is an understatement actually of what's happening on some of these sites. So there's workers' exploration. So in terms of transportation pipelines, does anyone have an idea of like what goes wrong in an oil pipeline? Go on.
Well, I think first of all they're going to have to clear land near the place, like all the way to wherever the nearest ports and transport links are. So they're going to destroy a lot more land than just where the oil is coming out, so that they can get all the infrastructure in and out.
I read a testimonial by a woman from Nigeria, and her farmland had suffered a lot of oil pollution, and she was recalling her happy childhood and how they enjoyed life, and she looked at what was happening to her children who were now trying to have their own families, and they were just all so scared for the next generations. And I think they were deciding to leave the area, but they didn't know how they could do that. And they had no hope. They talked about having no hope.
In Ecuador, there's a young woman activist called Helena Golinga who talked in a really good talk for Shadow magazine about the impact that was happening like currently in her home. And like, we'll come back to this in a minute, but they were experiencing floods as a result of climate change that was affecting their land and their water and their homes, and like just getting across a bridge to go and buy food had become impossible because of these floods. But also they needed to do that because they could not grow their own crops anymore. Like this is a clusterfuck, quite frankly, of like what happens to people. So you've got your pipelines just like spewing oil and all of the other chemicals in the refining and like transportation process, not just into the land but into the seas, and obviously that's affected like fishing. We've seen this in Alaska, like communities from like the Exxon Valdez spill have like been torn apart by the like political impact again of like the main economies of a town, of an area just being like fucked. Who is the daughter of Ken Saro-Wiwa, has just put together an exhibition in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford on the conditions that Nigerian oil workers live in. And that is, again, like so many of these companies. One of the things that we know, again, from Ghana is that they are trying to really recruit Ghanaian workers because they can treat them less well. So they have different conditions for expat workers, which is often white workers who come in, Europeans who come in, versus Ghanaian workers who are basically like housed in compounds. It is conditions often extremely close to slavery, essentially, and that does mean that we have seen like huge like strikes and things like that take place when people just refuse to work and sometimes kind of blockade these compounds that they're kept in and things like that. Hello, hi, welcome. We're of harm that's caused at every stage of what they do. Okay, go on.
When we were talking about workers, it made me think about man camps. And I was reading about how in Ecuador, in Yasuni ICT, in particular, well, I was reading about a particular case where, you know, basically you've got these huge encampments of mainly or exclusively male workers, and there's quite a lot of abuse of local indigenous women in particular by these workers, because you've basically just got all this, you've got all these men together, all this testosterone, and kind of a culture of, where it's acceptable to go out and abuse these communities, and in particular women who are seen as sort of inferior and less important. I'm sure that happens wherever extraction is taking place, and there are these man camps.
Essentially, some of the response, so we have finally, through repeated blockades of their research centre, got replies from them. On the one hand, they're like, oh no, we're transitioning to Schlumberger New Energy. On the other hand, when they renamed themselves to SLB back in September, the head of them made very, very clear that they were not signalling a transition away from oil and gas. So we're at the stage where they've kind of given us responses. Our very specific campaign in Cambridge is definitely at a point where there's been discussions held about kicking them off the land, but it all happens in this very polite Cambridgey way where the business relationships manager goes for drinks and sort of says, well, have you thought about not being here anymore? And they're like, no, we would like to stay here. So we've still got to keep pushing on that. And yeah, there are companies as well. So Baker Hughes and Halliburton are the two other just huge oil field services providers who are,
Say the first of those.
Baker Hughes. So I think it's really worth kind of mapping where those organisations are in our communities. Not everyone has a branch of SLB in their community, but maybe they do have, the headquarters of Baker Hughes or whatever, and I think we can share a lot of the kind of information about what it actually means to be an oil field services provider across those campaigns.